15. It was neat, and it was simple. They both came to the outside door. One of them opened it. Kate came into the anteroom, said, "Won't be long, Gail," and got locked in. She opened the inner door, entered, delivered the food, and left again. She locked the inner door and shouted, "Let me out, Gail," which Gail did, every day. 5 minutes every day to clamour and beg. 5 minutes to bargain and wheedle and argue. And all of the other minutes, of all the other hours, to ache and to question. What do they want? That was what Martine kept coming back to, like Laura came back to. When will someone come? And Ivy herself came back to. Why didn't she kill us with her little knife? Only none of them said it out loud now. The pain of arguing, of being at one another's throats, had been unbearable when it happened out of the blue one day. "Shut up!" Laura had screamed suddenly when Martine was talking about her hotel room, comforting herself, not doing any harm to anyone. "Shut up, shut up, shut up!" "Don't pick on her," Ivy had said. "Your little clique," Laura screamed. "Your cosy little twosome. You make me sick, both of you." "No wonder you needed a dating site," Martine said calmly. "You're a stone-cold bitch." "No wonder your father ran for the hills," Laura said. "Who'd want an anvil like you round his neck?" "Don't be such brats," Ivy said. "Don't be such poisonous little brats." She thought it would make her feel better to give in and say it, but it only put a lump of cold misery in her chest, as if she'd swallowed a stone, and she started sobbing. She and Laura cried for what felt like hours, while Martine banged her head over and over against the wall behind her. Then she cried too. They cried until they were sick and shaking, until their sweat had turned bitter, until their voices cracked and their eyes dried. Then came hours of silence. At the end of it, Ivy leaned sideways and picked up a water bottle. She took a swig and passed it to Laura. "Taste that," she said. She waited. "I think they've run out." "Let me taste," Martine said. She swilled a mouthful of water round her mouth. "You could be right." "But why would Igor stop slipping us the Valium, or whatever it is?" Laura said. "Igor?" said Martine. Ivy saw the flash of irritation cross Laura's face. Anytime she was reminded how young Martine was, that look swept over her, as if age mattered now. "Frankenstein's lab assistant," she said. "Good one, Laura. It suits her better than Kate." The next day, Ivy took the first sip from the water bottle after it was brought in, and when she tasted the bitterness there, she felt a warm surge of relief, and then of rage at herself. She passed the bottle to Laura, who took a deep swig. "Thank God for that," she said. "And how pathetic is it that I mean it with all my heart?" She passed the bottle to Martine, saying, "Little something for your nerves, madam?" Martine drank thirstily too. So maybe they wouldn't have ended up at each other's throats again, but still they were wary. They passed the baton carefully. One could be low at a time, no more. Round and round they passed it. Tears and rage and hope and despair. But always keeping those 3 questions quiet, like a prayer. They took turns for everything. It was Ivy's turn to choose what to ask for today. Kate didn't always comply, but often enough to make it worth trying. They'd got a toothbrush and a plaster for Martine's cut hand when she had scraped it on the frame of the fanlight, scrabbling for a way to find the edge of the thick, cloudy glass and knock it out. "1 toothbrush," Laura had said. "I could weep, or I could file it to a point and stab her." "You can have it," said Martine. "I don't mind using my finger with a baby wipe wrapped round." They'd got the baby wipes, Ivy thought. That helped. They washed with them, wiping their own fronts and having each other scrub their backs, eking out every last bit of clean smell and moisture. Then they hung them over a pipe that crossed the cellar at head height, and when they dried out, they went over to the drain, folded in a pile. That was another thing they'd fallen out over. Ivy saw Martine wipe after a pee, and before she knew what she was doing, she had burst out scolding like a monkey. She couldn't help herself, and Martine lashed back. Now they had the drain she wanted to be clean. It was different before. "Yes," said Ivy. "It was quieter." The drain was high above the sewer it fell to, and it was right in the middle of the floor. It was upsetting to squat there while two strangers listened to the stream that splashed into the pipe so far below, and the farts that rattled out of them all whenever they squatted, from the terrible food they ate and the lack of exercise. Whenever it was more than peas and farts, the other two would go as far as they could get and talk as loud as they could, only returning to the cardboard and the bit of light when they heard the scraper and the rumble of the metal sheet being pulled back over the hole. There was nothing down here that could be used as a screen either, not so much as an old curtain or even a bin bag they could slit up the sides and open out. Mind you, if there had been a curtain, it would have been too useful as a cover for their cardboard bed, or as a blanket, to waste it as a screen anyway. The drain was a find, all the same. Laura chiselled the cover off with her shoe heels, and once they recovered from the disappointment that it wasn't a trapdoor, they put all the used paper and rags in there and closed the lid back down on them. It still smelled unspeakable when the cover was lifted, but they breathed through their mouths. And they treated themselves to a fantasy of leaving it off, and of Kate tripping over the edge of the open hole and falling in, breaking her neck, lying there at the bottom, bent like a hairpin, begging for mercy. "You couldn't really do that, though," Ivy said. "Could I not?" Laura spoke so boldly, Ivy never could tell when she was serious and when she was just giving herself a boost. "She's as much the Ivy began, but Laura snorted. "Come off it, Ivy," she said. "Not the Nuremberg defence. But what's she supposed to do when Gail's right outside with the keys?" Ivy said. She really did feel pity for Kate. She hadn't wanted to go in and deal with poor little mice in the dark larder. Probably Kate didn't want to come in here and deal with the three of them either, but Gail didn't give her much choice. "She went up to Fraserburgh and came down to Lockerbie," Martine said. "She could have gone to a police station instead and said, 'My sister's a homicidal maniac and she needs locking up in a padded cell,'" Laura supplied. "You don't know what it's like," said Ivy. "Not to be the strong one. Not to be able to stand up to someone." She saw Laura open her mouth to say something Laura-like, but Martine got there first. "Don't mention yourself in the same breath as her, Ivy," she said. "I'm just saying, I understand why she's scared of Gail." "We all do," Laura said in a small voice. "I don't know what's worse, night or day." The first time they had heard Gail at night, the quiet slap of bare feet and the tick-tock of her knife, they had huddled together and whimpered. Ivy didn't know what the other two were thinking, but she was thinking, "This is it. Here it comes. Now she kills us." Only she didn't. She went away. And she went away the next time and the time after that. So now, when they heard her tick, tock, slap, slap, they put their hands over their ears. Sometimes, Ivy noticed, Martine still had her fingers stuffed in her ears when they all woke up in the morning. I never know whether I wish I'd seen her or I'm glad I didn't, Laura said, like she always did whenever they talked about Gail. Ivy wanted to add it to the list of things they weren't allowed to say. Instead, she patted Laura's arm. What are you going to ask for? She went on. Why? Said Ivy, thinking she heard an odd note in the question. What do you want? But Laura shook her head. I'll get my turn tomorrow. And what will you ask for then? Said Ivy. Tomorrow, Laura said. I'm going to ask for a hip bath, a Thai massage and a cannabis cookie. Ivy felt a flare of gratitude. Sometimes one of them could start joking. When that happened, they all tried to keep it going as long as possible. Have you ever had a cannabis cookie? Martine said. Have you, Ivy? Me, Ivy said. I've never even had vodka. She knew they'd pity her, but they'd laugh too. And so she did her bit. I've had a wine and beer and Pimm's one time at a brass band concert in a park, and I've had port and brandy to settle my stomach and whiskey on toothache, but not vodka. Mushrooms, said Laura. No, Ivy said, slowly, as if she was thinking. Ecstasy, though. Martine snorted. You've never had ecstasy, she said. You're too old. Charming. No, I've never had any of that. Poppers, uppers, downers, and I wouldn't want to start in here. It would drive you doolally if you had hallucinations in here and you couldn't get out. She had gone too far. No one laughed this time. I was in a club in London once, Laura said, and I put my brand new bag down on the cistern, and it stuck. Vaseline, to stop people sniffing coke off it, ruined 200 quid's worth of Italian leather. They were all silent then, remembering London and clubs, or at least films about them, thinking of handbags and bathrooms. Just like that, it had all run out again. I'll swap my day with you, Ivy found herself saying. You go next, and I'll go after. She heard Laura's breath catch in her throat and her whisper of, Why? Ivy couldn't tell them the truth. If they laughed at her, she might disintegrate until she was nothing but a pile of crumbs. Instead, she delved down into herself for a different story. But she was empty. So she took a pinch of the truth and served it up to them. Because you're just girls. I'm much older. I want to take care of you. It had come to her late last night. She had been dozing, warm at last, with the two of them cuddled up to her on either side. She had dreamed, half-dreamed anyway, of Mother. It wasn't really Mother. It was a woman with Mother's face and someone else's voice, leaning over Ivy, asking if she wanted a bowl of soup or a cup of cocoa. It might have been Glinda the Good Witch, whose voice had been Ivy's favourite sound when she was a child. Then she had opened her eyes and looked at the curve of Martine's arm lying over Ivy's own body, and the curl of Martine's hand against Ivy's stomach, how it bumped softly every time Ivy breathed. Maxine's skin was so smooth, even the thin bridge between her thumb and forefinger didn't have a single fold in it. Ivy put her own hand beside Martine's, looking at the elephant's kneecap swirl of her knuckles and the rough ribs of her nails. Martine's nails were little peach shells, each one with a pinpoint of light shining on it. Ivy told herself she was far too old to be thinking about Mother, wishing for the love that never had come and never would come now. She told herself she was nearly old enough to be Laura's mother, definitely Martine's. And that was when a thought dropped into her head like a round stone into a still pond. I will be the mother. I'll give the love. A thought so startling and so complete, she ran from it, ruffled and feeling foolish. But it had come back in the day. That was what she had to live for, instead of pining for death, begging Kate to kill her as she had when she was alone that first month. The thought climbed down from her mind and formed itself into that sentence, pushing an offer out of her mouth, a gift, like chewed fish in the gullet of a bird, or the rasping reach of a cat's tongue. Laura was staring at her. She turned to look at Martine, whose eyes were round and bright in the dimness. They were all getting used to the dimness now, the soft grey of day and the soft yellow of night, from the street lamp's bleary glow through that one tiny window choked with dirt. When they got out, if they got out, the daylight would be blinding. "No," said Martine, "there's no need for that. We're all in this together, no matter what age we are. What difference does that make? I mean, if one of us was a child or was elderly, but we're not. We're all the same." "Exactly," said Laura. "That said, if you can't think what to ask for, Ivy, how about socks?" Martine laughed, but Ivy bent her head in shame. Laura had been here a week. Her dress was stiff with sweat and dust, and her feet were stone cold all day as she moved around, only warming towards the end of the night when she tucked them close to Ivy's calves and stole some body heat. A real mother would have noticed that. "I'll ask for 3 pairs of socks tomorrow," she said. Laura said nothing, not even thank you, and Ivy's fragile little tower of hope collapsed again. Never loved, never loved, never loved, she told herself. So why keep going? "Why don't you kill me?" she had asked every day until Martine came. Then, "Why don't they kill both of us?" she asked until Martine wept and begged her not to. Then, when Laura came, she asked again, "Why don't they kill all 3 of us and get it over with? Wouldn't it be better now they've caught us, just to kill us? Wouldn't it be kinder?" If she had to spend another minute in this coal-black larder, she would cellar, she told herself. "You are grown up, Ivy, and this is a cellar you're trapped in." But still she dreamed of the larder and the mouse trap and the longed-for cat, and Mother saying, "Call the plumber, that tap's dripping again." And, "Even you'd shut up with your neck broken, Ivy." She did empty the trap that first day, and the next, and every day until once, walking towards the larger cupboard door, telling herself she was imagining the noise because it couldn't cry with a broken neck. Nevertheless, she heard it. It wasn't a squeak exactly. It was too exhausted to be as sharp a sound as a squeak. It sounded more like the last legs of a small battery, telling Ivy it needed changing. But as she opened the door, the scuffling started, a frantic scrabbling, and, as if the scrabbling recharged the battery, the slow chirps really were squeaks now. Ivy snapped the light on, half sure she'd see nothing, half hoping it was her imagination turning the scrape of a twig against the window into this impossible noise. But she knew it wasn't. There on the floor, caught in the trap by one bloody back foot, was the mouse, turning the trap over and over as it struggled with its front paws, clawing to get away from the pain and the light and this monster who had come. Ivy stood frozen, watching the pitiful little drama building to its climax on the floor in front of her. It didn't take long. In a minute, seemed longer but couldn't be, the mouse collapsed, its side fluttering up and down, and its paws, save for the one stretched out and bloody, contracting as its eyes closed. It took another minute, seemed shorter but couldn't be, for Ivy to pluck up the nerve to lift it. She took the dustpan from the nail on the back of the door and, with her face turned away, she shoved it across the tile floor like a snowplow, whimpering when she felt the sharp edge catch the trap and its tiny appendage. Then she tilted it back, whimpering louder to feel the weight slide towards the handle and thump against the metal. She trotted outside, lifted the dustbin lid and let the mouse, trap and all, fall in amongst the peelings and packets. She heard just one more squeak and told herself she didn't. Told herself it was her shoe leather on the cold ground or her own voice still whimpering. For years she told herself it was dead and she hadn't let it lie there in the dark and dirt, in pain and slowly starving. She was grateful to Mother for the scolding she got, throwing away a good mousetrap instead of emptying it. How would she like to rummage in a filthy bin to get it out? She wouldn't, would she? No, Mum. No, Mum. Ivy said, and soon enough, the harsh words filled her ears, and the tiny little dead battery squeak was silenced forever. Then, slowly, or quickly, who could say, she grew up. She grew to understand the cost of a mousetrap, £5.99 for a bag of 10 in the cheap shop with the brooms in buckets and the dusters done up like flower heads and stacked in baskets. But every night, in her bed, she would imagine she could hear it. Sometimes still, as she slept, she would dream a tiny meeping cry. Not until Mother was dead did she say to herself, I can have a cat. Now here she was in this cellar, punished for trying. Kate was there. She was putting a bag of apples and sandwiches down on the ground. Ivy hadn't noticed her coming. She was a different Kate from the chummy, confident little woman who'd bought brandy and stood up to louts in a pub. This Kate was blank and cold, as if she was emptying traps and trying not to hear the sounds of suffering. Even as her feet walked in and her hands put bags of food down, she was miles away, braced against the pleas she would ignore. But what if Ivy surprised her? Thank you, she said from the cardboard. We do appreciate the food, even if it's hard to understand why you're feeding us. Shh, said Kate. Dead people don't talk. The words, delivered so calmly, made Ivy's scalp shrink. Dead people don't eat either, Laura muttered under her breath. Oops. Could you bring us some blankets and pillows? Said Martine. Maybe even some clean clothes? Socks? Clean clothes, said Kate, in the same blank voice that lifted the hairs on Ivy's arms. Pillows? No. Dead people don't need them. A torch would be nice, said Laura, as if she hadn't heard. 3 torches, head torches, and something to read. Books, magazines. Dead people, Kate said, don't. 2 more toothbrushes and some toothpaste, said Martine in a bright voice. The devil had got into her, spreading from Laura. And some sanitary pads in the next day or 2. Kate's head snapped up. No, I can't buy those things you said. This shouldn't be happening. Dead people don't need anything. A pack of cards, then, said Ivy. If the other 2 could find the courage, she wasn't going to let them down. A radio. You wouldn't need to buy them if you've got spares. I have to go, said Kate, shooting a look over her shoulder. You don't, Martine said. You don't have to do any of this. She's my sister, Kate said. She opened the door at her back, but before she went through, she spoke again, hissing. Don't you understand? How dead do you want to be? Then she pulled the door shut with a slam, and her voice, as she called to Gail, was a cold bellow. Let me out, she boomed. Now! They sat in silence then, letting the sounds pass from echoes into memories. Ivy found it soothing to hear the plastic carrier bag settling with small pops and cracks. "Interesting," Laura said eventually. When Ivy realised it was up to her to answer, she made her voice sound as eager as she could and said, "Tell us." "She didn't mind socks or blankets," Laura said. "She'll have them in the house, and she can buy bread and cheese, apples and water, but she hated the idea of tampons and torches. Do you see what that means?" "Not tampons," said Martine. "We'd be dead of toxic shock before morning. No, I don't see what you're getting at." "They're buying supplies in shops where people know them," said Laura. "Local shops where the assistants would wonder why 2 women their age need Sanpro, or where they'd remember 3 head torches." "Okay," said Martine. "So what?" "So," said Laura, "can you think of anything we could ask them to buy that would be suspicious without them knowing, that wouldn't ring their alarm bells but might ring others, other people who'd come and save us?" "Oh," said Martine, "this again." Ivy had dug her nails into her palms so hard she thought they might be bleeding. Maybe she should make them bleed. Sepsis would work. "What do you think, Ivy?" Laura said. "Ivy?" She stretched and nudged her with an icy toe. "I wish she would kill us and get it over with. Sorry," she added at Martine's gasp. "But there's nothing to work out, and no one's coming to save us. They didn't pick our names out of a hat. They chose well." "Don't," Martine said. "They chose 3 women who lived alone and worked alone at home for themselves," Ivy said. "Women who were all alone. Women without husbands," Laura said. Her voice broke. "Women without parents," said Martine. "Or children," Ivy added, but when she saw tears shining in Martine's eyes, she wished she could take the words back again. In the quiet, Ivy dreamed of her perfect meal. Martine was probably dreaming about her hotel room again. Who knew what Laura was dreaming of, but at least she was actually sleeping. Ivy glanced at Martine and both of them smiled, listening to the soft, popping snores. Martine stretched Laura's legs out and cradled her feet, and Ivy pulled Laura's head down into her lap and smoothed back her hair. She stopped snoring, but didn't wake. Ivy kept stroking her hair back from her head, and Martine eased herself back, slower than the seasons, so she could keep Laura's feet safely in her lap. Like that, they waited. When Laura opened her mouth and smacked her lips together, the way she always did on waking, then rubbed her head back and forth as if scratching it on a pillow, Ivy said softly, "Welcome back, sleepyhead." Laura opened her eyes and looked straight up. Then she raised her head and looked down at Martine. "Have you been holding me?" she said. She screwed her head to the side and stared up at the square of window. "It's nearly dark." "It was good," Martine said. "It was time to think." "Not again." Laura's voice was weary, but there was warmth in it as well as warning. "It was what you said, Ivy," Martine began, "about them choosing well, choosing us well. I thought of something." Laura sat up and pulled her feet in. "I need a pee," she said. "You need a pee," said Martine, moving at last. "I've been stock still with your heels digging into my bladder since lunchtime." She stood and shook out her legs. "Ivy wanted a cat and got a sister. I wanted a dad and got a sister. Laura wanted a date and got a woman saying, 'Think of me as your sister,' Or, if we're willing to stretch a point, got a sister. So, said Laura, so they chose you, Laura, and they chose how to catch you, with the dating agency. For my pathetic sins, Laura said, shifting the sheet from over the drain and squatting. That made sense, though, Martine said, and so did I. I was researching my family history, and I didn't have a dad on my birth certificate, so the bait they trailed for me was about that. But do you see? Laura straightened halfway, then shook her behind to dry it. We'll all be championship twerkers by the time this is over, she said. See what? The story they told Ivy was completely bonkers. I wouldn't go that far, Ivy said. She was interested, in spite of herself. Of course you wouldn't, Martine said. She was squatting now. You fell for it. Oh, said Laura. I see what you're getting at. A story about a singles dance for someone looking for partners. Right, said Martine. Makes sense. Like a dad for a fatherless child. But where did that come from, that they told you, Ivy? You wanted a cat, and you got a sister. She was finished and had bent to slide the metal over the drain, but Laura pushed her away. I'll get that, she said. Your hand's not healed, and with the best will in the world, a plaster's not a magic wand. Martine rejoined Ivy at the cardboard, plopped down and stared at her. They told you were one of them. Swapped, Ivy, she said. And it was nothing to do with you and your life, like Kate said, nothing to do with you. So, said Laura, well, if it's nothing to do with Ivy, this sister swap, then it's something to do with them. So, said Laura, there's something I remember, Martine said. I heard it, but I was half asleep. No, God, not the podcasts, said Laura. Ivy shushed her. Try and remember, she said. True crime, said Martine, I think, or extreme. It might have been Oliver Sacks. I keep thinking Carpe Diem, but it's nothing to do with that. It's something to do with family. If we could work it out. Work out what it is they want. What it is they're doing. I'm sorry, Martine, Laura said, but you're clutching at straws. What we need to do is send a sign to someone who'll come and find us. If they'd let her be what she wanted to be, Ivy thought, she'd agree with both of them, comfort them, make it all better, like a mother should. But she'd got the message loud and clear. She wasn't wanted. They didn't need her. So instead, she spoke her mind. What we've got to do, she said, is face facts. We can sit down here going meep, 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 till our batteries run out and it won't change a thing. We're going to die. 16. I stood at the window and followed each drop on its race down the glass to gather at the transom and swell the drip, drip, drip onto the stone sill. There was a crack at the inner angle and moss growing where the putty should be. I imagined, standing there, that one day the block of stone would split off and fall to the ground. Then the next rain would seep into the fabric of the wall and show as a stain on the plaster. Soon the floor would rot too, and this building, so solid-seeming, that had stood here 100 years, would be gone. Good red stone slumping like a sandcastle at the high tide wasn't really what was troubling me, only when nothing felt sure anymore, and every step was a step towards the unthinkable, it was no wonder that even stone and glass, wood and plaster, concrete steps and iron banisters felt like a little house of straw. I had been here for 2 days, 5 left, and I still didn't know if it was genius or madness, precaution or paranoia. How far would Big Gary go to shut me up? Should I just give in and call the police? On the little burner I'd bought, 10 minutes after fleeing BG that horrible, skin-crawling, insane, impossible day? Calling the cops would mean giving up the takeover, the reparations, the whole plan to balance out what he had done. So much worse in the end than what I thought he'd done. Him and Lynn and Baz. At the thought of Baz, I nearly smiled. I'd never have come up with Airbnb if I hadn't heard about his pop-up shops. My dad had given me the rest of it, though he didn't know. Shetland, Cornwall, London, he'd said, taunting me. Hiding in plain sight, he'd said, bragging about Baz's cleverness. And so here I was, in a flat in West Lothian, 12 miles from home. I changed my mind every 10 minutes about whether it was bold or idiotic to be so close to where I'd been born and where I'd lived throughout my childhood. 12 miles from the town where my dad was the biggest employer after the supermarkets. But while I kept watch out of the window, I checked for faces I knew, and I had come to see that this town might as well be another world, with a different high school where kids made different friends, and a different police station where different Neds got a reputation with different coppers. Every one of these little towns, I thought to myself, was so turned in on itself, even if they were joined on nose to tail these days. There was no cross-fertilization because there was no destination in any of them that would pull people from any of the others. Each had its own chippy and Chinese, its own Turkish barbers and pet groomers, and no one would dream that the butcher 2 towns over would offer better cuts than the butcher right here who called them by name and remembered their mum. I was trying hard not to think about why there was an Airbnb here. I refused to imagine what might have happened in this flat before I got here, between the faded, bobbled sheets of the only bed, on the flattened, darkened moleskin of the couch, even on the hard, washable floor of the cheerless bathroom. Instead, I looked out the windows, not dwelling on what I was looking for, what I was frightened of. My dad wouldn't to stop me, would he? I leaned my head against the glass and looked through the raindrops, trying to find distraction. The yards of the shops below were tucked too tightly against the back wall for me to see whatever went on there, although I heard them banging in and out underneath me, taking flattened cardboard out to store it till bucket day. The folk from the chippy humping big bins of old fat over the slabs. If I opened my window, I'd hear the 2 girls from downstairs out for a smoke, sitting on the old coal bunker lid, joshing and plotting. I wished I could go and join them. It had been a lonely few months, but even if I booked myself in for an appointment, I wouldn't get out the back for a fag break. I peeled myself away at last and walked the length of the room towards the front. This room, through and through from the street to the back garden, was the best bit of the flat and the reason I had rented it. There wasn't much else besides, just a barely double bedroom with a painted-over fireplace nipping off one corner, a cold bathroom with chips in the bath and a permanent line round the toilet bowl, and a galley kitchen in an offshoot, where a gutless extractor whined uselessly and never managed to stop the smoke alarm going off before the toast was ready. But this room was different. The skirtings were deep, and the cornicing and centre rows were fancy enough to have made it worth picking them out in a different colour of paint. And sometime in the history of the house, a tenant or maybe an owner had sprung for a good wool carpet in dark red. It had survived the 70s, when it might have been ripped out and replaced with beige, and the 80s, when it would have been lifted to sand the boards, and now it felt warm and proper under my feet. A good dark red wool carpet with flecks of black in it, no stains and no burns for a wonder. At the front window, I brushed aside the curtains. These weren't survivals from a moment of prosperity in the lifetime of the flat. These were landlord specials, thin cream IKEA, hanging from not enough curtain rings on a squint rod that was held to the wall by half-extruded roll plugs. There was no one down there. I was being paranoid. He wouldn't, would he? But then he was probably telling himself the same thing. She wouldn't really, would she? And I would. I was going to. Just like he had done what he had done, him and Lynn and Baz too. I knew more about it now, from Googling on my cheap little laptop with the pay-as-you-go dongle I'd bought, for cash, at the nearest Argos, that blood-chilling, bone-chilling, heart-chilling day. That, I was nearly sure, was total paranoia. Nearly. Maybe I'd be more sure I was paranoid if he had been smuggling like I thought, fleecing folk for a quiet arrival, folk that wanted to come. Maybe then he'd have taken my deal and retired to the sun. Maybe that man, crooked and greedy, would have bitten my arm off. But my dad wasn't that man, I knew now. I knew now that they signed papers in English, thinking it was for visas. Then it didn't matter what the papers actually said. They'd believe whatever they were told. 6 months to pay off the airfare, one more job, then back home with a bonus. Just till a college place opened up. I still couldn't believe I had missed the crucial bit of that news report. Women and girls. I didn't think I would ever get it out of my head now. Some as young as 12. What broke me, once I started Googling, was knowing that often as not, they loved their handlers. They loved a man, and trusted him, and couldn't believe he wasn't what they hoped he was. Couldn't believe he was what they watched him be. Not so different from me, really, wising up too late. I bet their plans looked quaint to them too now, just like my plan to raise money from migrant shelters and make up for the smuggling. How would I atone for what had really happened? A business, click and collect, supply and demand, Russian bosses. I was too late to help any of them. Maybe I was even too late to help myself. Maybe I'd be just one more girl who went away. He wouldn't, would he? There was no one down there except a drunk at the bus stop. Or maybe not a drunk, maybe just a guy having a can till his bus came. A retired couple came out of the pub, the Paraffin Arms it was called, unbelievably. They were dressed in matching fleeces and matching trainers, but they were arguing bitterly, glowering at one another as they turned into the stair of their flat. A dog trotted past, all alone. It stopped to sniff up at the litter bin, but there was nothing lying around it except Coke tins, all the chip papers neatly inside. So it lifted its leg and trotted on. I watched the empty street for a while, until the drunk finished his can, crushed it, and dropped it. Then I set off back through the flat to the kitchen window again. Over the high wall from the shop's bin stores, nothing was moving. There didn't seem to be any kids on the side street that stretched away behind the flat, which was a waste, because the gardens were far longer than anything a modern house would ever get, as the builders chunked up the land. They were left over from the days there'd be a drying green and a vegetable plot, a pig at the end and a stable beyond. Most of the stables had been flattened and replaced, but a few had survived, bare brick and dusty windows, garages now. I rolled my head the other way. Considering it was a stone's throw to a bookie's, a chippy and a nail bar, this street was fairly posh, although one of the houses had a broken window in a kitchen offshoot, stopped up with cardboard behind the bars. Cardboard aside, though, it was cute. A little cottage squeezed in beside a bigger villa, with a steep roof and a bit of fancy ironwork along the peak. It had a cellar door down a set of mossy steps, that dropped without railings from the edge of the lawn, just a dark hole against the back of the house. A death trap. Maybe it was the months of driving a patient transport van and a special needs student bus, but it bothered me to see the homeowner running up and down those steps, no safety rail, doing whatever it was she did in there. Washing, maybe, or getting stuff in and out of a chest freezer. She lived alone, I reckoned, because I hadn't seen a husband at the back door or in the long grassy garden. There was just that one little woman in her slippers on the wet grass, up and down, like a pigeon at a lever. But watching a little old lady pottering round her garden wasn't going to help anyone. Wearing a track in the carpet between the front windows and the back, either. Am I going to the cops? I asked myself, standing back so I could see my reflection instead of the view. No, because too many people will lose their jobs. Am I going back in 5 days to see if he blinks? Yes. Do I really believe he would? I looked hard at myself in the glass, watching the rivulets track down through my reflection. No, but I'll make sure I'll be missed if I suddenly disappear, in case I'm wrong, in case he would, in case he means to. When I was showered and dressed, I let myself out of my front door, clattered down to the street door, and stepped out into the drizzle, hunching my shoulders and pressing the Velcro shut on my coat for the scoot across the road. The newsagent's was nearest, so I made for it with my head down and my hands jammed in my pockets, hopping over puddles. Inside, it was dark and crammed with tat, the air thick from decades of newspaper ink. The look I got from the man behind the counter was the one he'd give any woman between 16 and 40 that came through his door, but he wasn't a bad sort. As I made my way towards him, he straightened his face out and pasted on a customer service sort of smile. "Hiya," I said. "I'm just moved in across the road, above Hollywood Nails." "Aye, looking for work? Because this is my uncle's place and I've got 7 first cousins all married and—" "A paper," I said. "Do you deliver?" "Deliver? Where have you been living? There's not been a paper boy in the hall since I was at school, earning 3 halfpenny for mine." "Oh," I said. "And you're only across the way," he pointed. "You could lean out your window." "No, it's not that," I said. "It's just so's I'm not taking my chances there's one left. Ideally, I'd like a paper every day and a couple of mags." "Aye, no bother. I can order in for you and keep them back. You'll need to pay as you go, or pay in advance a wee month or two, mind. No offence, but I don't know you from a hole in the ground." "None taken," I said, feeling my heart lift as he twisted round and grabbed a ledger from behind him. He thumped it down onto the counter and licked his thumb. "A Scotsman, every day, please," I said. I'd rather have had a Herald, but I didn't want to put his back up and I wasn't sure which side of the continental divide this was. And a Women's Fitness and a Better Homes and Gardens. I couldn't have made myself read either cover to cover, but they were nice and pricey and the newsagent would wonder why I wasn't picking them up if I stopped. "Name," he said, looking up at me with his pencil hovering. "Tash Dodd." I wondered if it would light a spark 12 miles from Big Gary's kingdom, but he just bent his head and printed it in the ledger. "Tash, for every day," I added. He put the pencil down, held out a hand and smiled. "Adim, you know they're cheaper online, don't you? And they deliver." "Your uncle would string you up if he heard you," I said. "Your Scotsman'll start tomorrow," Adim said. "There's a couple there if you're after one today." He pointed to a low rack with papers stacked on it. I took one, picked up a Twix and a Coke, and handed over enough cash to charge a month's worth of reading. Feeling stupid, I'd taken out a good wedge after the burner shop and before Argos. Baz couldn't hack a bank, I told myself, even as I keyed my PIN. Adim's eyes widened at the sight of the money. Should I say something? Tell him I was hiding from an ex with a joint bank account? I'm trying out this strict budget trick I went for in the end. Take out a month's cash and make it last. No impulse buys with your contactless. Not very strict if it covers better homes, Adeem said. One of the girls in Hollywood Nails looked up from her phone when I opened the door. The other was at a delicate stage in the application of strip lashes. Hiya, I said. I've been meaning to come and say hello. I've just moved in, upstairs. We saw you, looking out the window, said the girl, who'd already got her lashes on. Her face was mesmerizing. She wore foundation so far from skin tone it was almost green, and she'd shaded her nose, jaw and temples with stripes of dark brown, highlighted her forehead, cheeks and chin with streaks of sparkling bronze. Her eyebrows were an inch deep and so perfectly square she must have used a stencil to paint them. Her lips were invisible behind thick, matte lipstick, the same colour as her foundation. We were thinking of grabbing you and tying you down, said the other one. She looked up from her mirror and batted both sets of lashes. She was a more normal colour for a white girl, with bands of deep peach simulating rosy cheeks and lips, stained red and glittering with shimmer gloss. They each, I noticed, wore a selection of the nails on offer, 10 different patterned and textured acrylics. Yeah, I've let things slide a bit, I said, feeling my spirits, which Adeem had already lifted, really start to soar. I was thinking of booking myself in for a regular. Depends what you do, actually. Mani-pedi threading and massage, the chalky green girl said, waving her arms around as if the chairs and foot baths, the tables and counters, should speak for themselves. Massage would be fantastic, I said. But is it weird to do it to people you know? We don't know you though, do we? Said the peach and red girl with the tarantula lashes. I'm Aisling. That's Rennie, by the way. Tash, Natasha. And no, anyway, it's not weird. Thanks for asking. I wish it was. Number of randoms we went to school with coming in on the mooch. Were you at school together then? I said, accepting a printed menu of treatments and looking it over. We're sisters, said Aisling. Duh. I loved them both for that, duh. I hadn't realised, in Fraserburgh, Lockerbie and Ayr, how much I'd missed my own people, hard as nails, dry as biscuits, impressed by absolutely nought. I took a closer look and, right enough, the bones were the same, and the pale blue eyes. Well, I'd love Friday, last thing, I said, but I'm guessing that's a busy time of the week for you, so how are you fixed on Wednesday afternoons? We could squeeze you in, said Rennie. Wednesday morning would be even better. Lunchtime, I said. How about every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, and I'll rotate, hands, feet, back and brows? Both the girls perked up at the sniff of such regular business, and I found myself hoping Hollywood Nails wasn't on its uppers. Can I ask, though? I said. Can you really do massage? And the rest of it? How? Said Aisling. With your nails, I mean. God, listen to Granny, Rennie said, flushing under her green makeup. Next you'll be asking if we paid good money for our ripped jeans. Aisling laughed and took up the theme. What are those tattoos going to look like when you're an old woman, though? Any more piercings and you'll start leaking, Rennie said. Aye, I said. Geez, you're worse than Adeem. Adeem asks us if we're warm enough, Rennie said. How old are you, anyway? She had stopped laughing and was giving me a hard stare. I couldn't have said how old this pair were. They had puppy fat still, but the drag queen makeup aged them. 30, I said. I felt 80. Huh, said Rennie. We thought you were young and just didn't bother. You're lucky to be wearing so well. If your skincare regime's anything like your makeup and nail regime, you should look like Mother Teresa, by rights. Wow, I said. Right, well, put me down for Wednesday lunchtime and you can decide what's the biggest emergency. Okay, Tash Dodd. Again, both the girls broke out into spurts of laughter. Tash Dodd! Oh, you poor cow. Tash Dodd! It sounds like baked spud, said Rennie, screaming with laughter at her own wit and making Aisling choke. How? What's your name that's so glamorous? I said, knowing I sounded huffy. That sobered them both. Hollywood, Rennie said. Duh. Well, I'm away now, I said. I might go to the health club, see if they've got a resident masseuse. So I might be down to 2 Wednesdays in 4, and if you need a cup of sugar any time, I'm sure Adeem'll sell it to you. Sarky bitch, said Rennie with a smile. We're going to be besties. Tash Dodd. And the masseur at the gym is a handsy wee creep. Always was, and he only went into massage because it means you can't stop him. Don't tell me, I said. You were at school with him, yeah? I didn't drive to the gym, though. I just moved my hire car onto the side street with the open parking. A hire car. As if Baz could hack the police computer to find my own one. This was pure paranoia, like the burner and the dongle and the cash. He wouldn't anyway. Not my dad. Would he? I was outside the front garden gate of the fairytale cottage. It was even more unreal looking from here, with a garden full of apple trees, just moving from pale pink blossom to the softest little yellow-green leaves. And it had a round bay window with a turret on top. It was so out of place that it unnerved me. I had chosen Hep-Haw to hide in for its anonymity, stupidly, but I wasn't going to beat myself up. Even this tiny pocket of noticeable character, this one pretty house, diluted my perfect bolt hole. I shrugged the thought off myself as I made my way down to the mouth of the main street and my own front door. I'd chosen well. Hep-Haw was a grey town where nothing happened. It was perfect for me.